I'm 61 years old now, and for the last 32 years, I've carried a secret that has defined every single day of my life since May of 1993. In the storage room behind my house, there's a locked filing cabinet that contains photographs, tissue samples, and detailed journals that document something the scientific community insists cannot exist. My name is Dr. Rebecca Marsh, and I spent 40 years as a marine biologist specializing in cetacean behavior and marine mammal rehabilitation. I have 3 published books, a doctorate from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and a reputation built on careful, peer-reviewed research. Everything in my professional life has been about evidence, data, and the rigorous application of the scientific method, which is why what I'm about to tell you has been so difficult to reconcile. On May 17, 1993, a mermaid brought me her dying child and asked me to save it, and I did. For 3 weeks, I cared for an infant creature that possessed both lungs and gills, that had the upper body of a human infant and the lower body of something between a dolphin and a seal, and that displayed a level of intelligence and emotional awareness that I had only seen in the most cognitively advanced mammals. The mother returned every night to check on her baby's progress, waiting in the waters just beyond my property. When the infant recovered, I returned it to her, and she thanked me in a way that left no doubt she understood exactly what I had done. I never reported it, not to my colleagues, not to the research institutions I worked with, not to any government agency. I made that choice deliberately, knowing what would happen if the world learned these creatures were real. I've spent 3 decades living with that decision, watching that same stretch of coastline and keeping detailed private records of what I continue to see. Last month, something happened that made me realize I can't keep this secret anymore. The mermaid I helped, now fully grown, brought her own infant into the shallows near my home. She stayed there, clearly visible in the early morning light, until she knew I had seen her. It was a message, I believe, an acknowledgement of trust that has somehow been passed down. Some people will call this impossible. Others will say, I've lost my credibility by coming forward with such a claim. But I'm 61 years old. I'm retiring from academic life next year, and I've decided that the truth matters more than my reputation. This is exactly what happened, documented as carefully as I know how, and I'm telling it now because I believe these creatures deserve to have their existence acknowledged, even if it's only in a story that most people will dismiss as fiction. The sound that shouldn't exist. May 17, 1993 began like most Monday mornings had for the previous 8 years. I woke at 5:30 a.m. in my small house on the Mendocino coast, 2 miles north of the town proper, where the shoreline was still relatively undeveloped and my nearest neighbor was half a mile down the beach. The property had belonged to my aunt, and when she passed in 1985, I'd bought it from the estate specifically because it gave me private access to a protected cove that I used for my rehabilitation work with injured seals and sea lions. I'd been working with the Marine Mammal Center in Sausalito since 1987, and my isolated location made it ideal for temporary housing of animals that needed quiet recovery away from public beaches. That morning, I'd planned to spend a few hours updating my field notes from the previous week. I'd been tracking a pod of gray whales migrating north, documenting their surface behavior and timing their breathing patterns. It was routine work, the kind of steady data collection that forms the foundation of long-term population studies. I made coffee, set up my laptop at the kitchen table that faced the large windows overlooking the cove, and began transcribing my handwritten observations. At 6:47 a.m., I heard something that made me stop typing mid-sentence. It was a vocalization coming from the water, and my first assumption was that it was a seal. We had a small colony of harbor seals that used the rocks at the north end of the cove, and I was used to their barking calls, especially during pupping season, but this sound was different. It had a tonal quality that was higher pitched than seal vocalizations, with a tremolo that rose and fell in a pattern I didn't recognize. More unsettling was the emotional quality of it. I'd spent 2 decades listening to marine mammals, and I'd learned to distinguish between calls that were territorial, mating-related, or distress signals. This sound carried unmistakable distress, but there was something else in it too, something that my brain kept trying to categorize as human grief. I stood up from the table and moved to the window. The morning fog was still heavy, the kind of thick coastal fog that reduces visibility to maybe 30 or 40 feet. The cove was gray and indistinct, the water barely visible beyond the rocky beach. I could hear waves breaking gently against the shore, and somewhere in that white emptiness, the sound continued. It would stop for 10 or 15 seconds, then resume, each time with that same rising, desperate quality. I pulled on my boots and waterproof jacket, grabbed my binoculars, even though I knew they'd be useless in the fog, and headed down the wooden stairs that led from my back deck to the beach below. The stairs were steep, 83 steps that I'd counted hundreds of times, built directly into the cliff face. My property sat about 60 feet above the waterline, which meant the cove stayed relatively private. The isolation had always been one of its best features. When I reached the beach, I stood still and listened. The sound was clearer now, definitely coming from the water, somewhere out in the fog near the center of the cove. I moved toward it slowly, my boots crunching on the mixture of sand and small stones that made up the beach. The tide was coming in, and small waves were washing up around larger rocks that dotted the shoreline. Kelp lay in dark tangles where the previous high tide had deposited it. The vocalization came again, and this time I could tell it was moving. Whatever was making the sound was getting closer to shore. I stopped about 15 feet from the water's edge and waited, my hand instinctively going to the radio I kept clipped to my belt. It was standard equipment for anyone doing marine work in isolated areas. If this was an injured animal in the shallows, I might need to call for backup from the Marine Mammal Center. The fog shifted slightly, and I saw movement in the water. At first, it was just a dark shape, maybe 20 feet offshore, barely visible through the mist. The shape moved in a way that seemed too controlled, too deliberate for an injured animal struggling in the surf. I raised my binoculars, but the fog made them nearly worthless. I could make out something dark breaking the surface, then submerging again. Another vocalization, this one so clear and close that I felt my breath catch. The sound had a structure to it, almost like phrasing, a rising tone, a pause, then a falling tone that ended in what I can only describe as a sob. I'd never heard anything like it from any marine mammal I'd studied, and I'd worked with seals, sea lions, dolphins, and whales for my entire career. This was something else entirely. I took 3 steps closer to the water. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous even as I did it. But the sound was so disturbingly human that my instinct was to respond as if I were approaching a person in distress. The shape in the water went still. The vocalization stopped. For maybe 30 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of waves and the distant call of a gull somewhere up the beach. Then, slowly, the shape began moving toward shore again. This time, I could see it more clearly. Something was breaking the surface, something that rose higher than a seal's head would rise, something with shoulders. My heart rate increased. I was already running through possibilities in my mind. A swimmer in a wetsuit, maybe someone who'd gotten into trouble in the current and was trying to make it to shore. But we were 2 miles from the nearest public beach access, and the water temperature in May was maybe 52 degrees. No one swam here without extensive cold water gear, and even then, only experienced divers. The figure came closer, and the fog thinned just enough for me to see it clearly for the first time. It was in the shallows now, maybe 8 feet from shore, and it was holding something. The posture was unmistakable, arms cradled against the chest, head bent down, the protective curl of a parent holding a child. But the body was wrong. The proportions weren't right. The figure was too large across the shoulders, too long in the arms. and the way it moved through the water was far too smooth, too powerful. I took another step forward. The water was washing over my boots now, cold seeping through to my socks. The figure turned toward me, and I saw its face. Even now, 32 years later, I can close my eyes and see every detail of that moment. The face was female, unmistakably so. The features were human. Wide-set eyes, a defined nose, a mouth that was open in an expression of desperate grief. The skin was pale, almost gray in the early morning light, and the hair was long and dark, plastered against her head and shoulders. But below the water line, where I expected to see legs, I saw instead the powerful muscular curve of a tail. It moved beneath her with subtle undulations, keeping her stable in the shallow water, and it caught the light with a faint iridescence that reminded me of fish scales. She made the sound again, that rising, falling vocalization, and she lifted what she was holding slightly out of the water. It was an infant, smaller, maybe 2.5 feet long from head to tail, with skin that looked almost translucent. The baby wasn't moving. Its small head lolled against her chest, and even from where I stood, I could see it was in distress. The breathing was wrong, labored, and irregular. The mother looked directly at me. Her eyes were large and dark, similar to a seal's eyes, but with a visible sclera that made them more human. And in those eyes, I saw something that made my training, my education, every scientific principle I'd built my career on, suddenly seem completely inadequate. I saw intelligence. I saw desperate hope. And I saw a mother who believed her child was dying and had made an impossible choice to trust the only help available. She moved closer, and I realized with absolute clarity what was happening. She was bringing me her baby. She was asking me to save it. First sight. I stood in the ankle-deep water and felt my entire understanding of the natural world tilt sideways. The creature in front of me shouldn't exist. Mermaids were mythology, folklore, stories told by sailors who'd mistaken manatees for women or who'd spent too long at sea. I'd spent 40 years studying marine biology, and nothing in the fossil record, nothing in evolutionary biology, nothing in the extensive documentation of marine species supported the existence of what I was looking at. But she was there, real and solid and desperate, holding her dying infant in the shallows of my cove, watching me with eyes that held clear expectation. My scientific training kicked in automatically, even as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. I began cataloging details, the same way I would document any new specimen. The mother was approximately 7 feet in total length, with what appeared to be a normal human torso from the waist up. Her skin was pale gray, smoother than human skin, almost like a dolphin's texture, but without the rubbery quality. The transition from torso to tail occurred at approximately where a human's hip joint would be, and the tail itself was powerful and muscular, similar in structure to a pinniped's rear flippers, but formed as a single vertical fluke rather than separated limbs. The tail's coloring was darker than her upper body, a deep gray-green with lighter ventral surfaces. Small scales were visible when she moved, catching the weak morning light. Her face was remarkably human. The bone structure was similar to human facial anatomy, though the eyes were proportionally larger and positioned slightly more laterally. Her nose was flatter, the nostrils positioned higher on the face and with visible muscular control that suggested they could close underwater. The mouth was wide, and when she vocalized again, I caught a glimpse of teeth that looked more human than shark-like. No pointed canines, just flat-crowned teeth suitable for an omnivorous diet. Her arms were longer than human proportions would suggest, maybe 10% longer relative to her torso, and her hands had elongated fingers with visible webbing between them. The nails were dark and appeared thicker than human nails, almost claw-like but not sharp or threatening. The infant she held was clearly in severe distress. Its breathing was rapid and shallow, visible as small movements of its chest and what appeared to be gill slits on its neck. The gills were opening and closing irregularly, not in the steady rhythm I would expect from healthy respiratory function. The baby's skin had a bluish tint that suggested oxygen deprivation, and there were visible injuries along its left side. 3 parallel lacerations, deep enough that I could see the underlying tissue, running from just below the ribcage down to where the tail began. The wounds looked clean-edged, not torn, possibly from a boat propeller or a shark's teeth. The mother made another sound, this one shorter and more urgent. She moved forward another foot, bringing herself into water that was barely deep enough to support her body. She had to arch her back to keep the infant's head above water, and I could see the physical strain it was causing her. She pushed the baby toward me, extending her arms fully, and the gesture was so universally recognizable that it transcended species. She was offering me her child. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. My breath was coming too fast, and I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs. Every instinct I had was screaming contradictory instructions. Run, because this is impossible, and dangerous, and beyond anything you can handle. Stay, because this is the most important discovery in human history, and you're a scientist. Help, because regardless of what this creature is, it's a mother with a dying baby, and you have the skills to try to save it. I took a breath and made a decision. I stepped forward into the water, moving slowly so I wouldn't startle her. The cold was immediate and shocking, soaking through my pants and jacket, but I barely registered it. I was focused entirely on the infant in her arms. "Okay," I said quietly, my voice steady despite everything I was feeling. "Okay, I'll try to help. But I need to examine him first. It. I need to see how bad the injuries are." I knew she couldn't understand my words, but I hoped the tone would communicate something. Non-threatening, willing to help, careful. I moved closer, and she watched me with absolute focus. When I was within arm's reach, she lowered the infant slightly, allowing me to see the wounds more clearly. The lacerations were deep, penetrating through the epidermis and into the muscle beneath. The edges were clean, which supported my propeller theory. There was minimal bleeding, which could mean either that the wounds were older and had already begun clotting, or that these creatures had different blood chemistry than I was familiar with. The gills on the infant's neck were opening and closing in spasms, suggesting respiratory distress. I could also see its chest, moving rapidly, using its lungs simultaneously with the gills, which indicated it had a dual respiratory system. "The wounds need to be cleaned and closed," I said, still keeping my voice calm and low. "And I need to get him warm and stable. I have equipment, medical supplies, tanks for marine mammals, but I need to take him up to my facility. Do you understand?" The mother's expression didn't change, but she looked from me to the infant and back again. Then she did something that made my throat tighten. She leaned forward and pressed her face against the top of the baby's head, a gesture of affection and grief that was heartbreakingly familiar. She held the position for several seconds, then straightened and extended the infant toward me fully. I reached out and carefully took the baby from her arms. It was heavier than I expected, maybe 25 pounds, with a solid density that suggested denser bone structure than a human infant would have. The skin was cool to the touch, cooler than mammalian body temperature should be, and had that same smooth, almost slippery texture as the mother's skin. The infant's eyes were closed, and it made a weak sound as I lifted it, a thin cry that was barely audible. The moment I had secure hold of the baby, the mother pulled back slightly, creating a few feet of distance between us. But she didn't leave. She stayed there in the shallow water, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the infant in my arms. "I'm going to take care of him," I said, knowing she couldn't understand, but needing to say it anyway. "I'm going to try to save him, but you need to stay here or nearby. I don't know how to care for your species. I might need you to show me things. Do you understand?" Stay close." I backed away slowly, moving toward the beach. The infant's breathing was becoming more labored, and I knew I didn't have much time. Shock, blood loss, infection, any number of complications could be setting in. I needed to get it stabilized immediately. The mother followed my retreat with her eyes but didn't move from her position. When I reached the dry sand, I turned and began walking as quickly as I could toward the stairs that led up to my house. Behind me, I heard her make one more vocalization, long and mournful, and then silence. I climbed those 83 stairs faster than I ever had before, my arms burning with the effort of carrying the infant while moving quickly enough to matter. My mind was racing through everything I would need: salt water tank, temperature regulation, first aid supplies, antibiotics if I had anything that might work on an unknown species. I would have to use my knowledge of marine mammal physiology as a baseline and hope that enough would translate. When I reached the deck, I kicked open the back door and went straight to what I called my rehabilitation room. It was a converted sunroom on the east side of the house, 15 by 20 feet, with industrial sinks, storage for medical supplies, and 3 large fiberglass tanks that I used for temporarily housing injured seals while they recovered enough to be transferred to larger facilities. The largest tank was empty, and I'd cleaned it the previous week. It would have to do. I laid the infant on the examination table I'd built along one wall, a stainless steel surface with drainage that I'd salvaged from a veterinary clinic. The baby's breathing was definitely getting worse, the chest movements more shallow, the gill openings barely fluttering. I grabbed my stethoscope and pressed it against the small chest. The heartbeat was rapid, maybe 200 beats per minute, and irregular, not good. I ran to the largest sink and began filling it with cold water, adjusting the temperature to match the ocean temperature outside, roughly 52 degrees Fahrenheit. While the sink filled, I grabbed clean towels from the storage cabinet and wet them, then draped them over the infant's body to keep the skin from drying out. The skin texture suggested these creatures needed to stay moist, similar to amphibians, but with the added complexity of being primarily aquatic. The sink filled, and I carefully transferred the infant into it, supporting its head and keeping the wounds above water initially so I could clean them. I used sterile saline solution to irrigate the lacerations, clearing away what looked like bits of kelp and sand. The wounds were worse than I'd initially thought. The deepest one had penetrated through to what might be an abdominal cavity, and I could see internal tissue that I couldn't identify. The anatomy was completely unfamiliar. I applied pressure with gauze to slow the minimal bleeding that continued from the deepest wound, then used surgical tape to create a temporary closure. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't dare attempt actual sutures without understanding the tissue structure better. The risk of doing more harm than good was too high. The infant's breathing improved slightly once it was fully immersed in the cold water. The gills began moving more regularly, though still not with the steady rhythm I would have liked to see. I grabbed my portable oxygen tank, the one I kept for emergencies with marine mammals, and rigged a makeshift delivery system that would increase the oxygen content of the water in the sink. It was crude, but it was the best I could do. For the next 2 hours, I worked steadily, monitoring vital signs, adjusting water temperature, changing the water every 30 minutes to keep it clean and oxygenated. The infant remained unconscious, which worried me, but its breathing gradually stabilized into a more regular pattern. The heart rate came down to around 160 beats per minute and maintained a steadier rhythm. At 9:15 a.m., I finally allowed myself to step back and take a full breath. The baby was stable, not recovered, not out of danger, but stable enough that I didn't think it was going to die in the next few hours. I had bought some time. I looked out the window toward the cove. The fog had burned off and I could see the water clearly now. And there, just beyond the breaking waves, maybe 40 feet offshore, I could see a dark shape in the water. The mother. She was still there, waiting. Chapter 3. The Injured Infant. By noon, I'd transferred the infant from the sink to the largest of my 3 rehabilitation tanks. The tank was 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet deep, originally designed to house juvenile seals. I'd filled it with fresh seawater that I pumped directly from the cove using my filtration system, and I'd adjusted the temperature to maintain the same cold conditions the infant would be accustomed to. The baby was floating now, its buoyancy seeming more natural in the deeper water, and I'd rigged a soft mesh support beneath it to keep it from sinking if it lost consciousness again. I'd also set up my video camera on a tripod, pointed at the tank, recording everything. If I was going to document an unknown species, I needed to do it properly. The scientific part of my brain was already thinking about how to catalog what I was observing, even as the rest of me was still trying to process the impossibility of the situation. The infant was male. I'd confirmed that during my initial examination, though the anatomy was different enough from human anatomy that it had taken me a few minutes to be certain. The external genitalia were positioned more ventrally than in humans, similar to cetacean anatomy, which made sense given the streamlined body plan. Everything about this creature's morphology suggested adaptation for fully aquatic life, yet it clearly had functioning lungs alongside the gills. Dual respiratory systems were rare in nature. Some amphibians managed it during certain life stages, and lungfish had a primitive version, but nothing I'd ever studied had this level of sophisticated dual adaptation. I'd taken tissue samples from the edges of the wounds while cleaning them, using sterilized tools and storing the samples in preservative solution. I felt guilty doing it without consent, but this was potentially the only opportunity science would ever have to study these creatures at a cellular level. I'd also collected a small vial of blood when I'd noticed seepage from one of the deeper lacerations. The blood was red, suggesting hemoglobin-based oxygen transport, similar to mammals, but it was slightly thicker than human blood and had a faint greenish tint in certain light. I'd need a microscope to examine it properly, but that would have to wait. The wounds themselves were my primary concern. I'd done the best I could with cleaning and temporary closure, but the deepest laceration needed more attention. I could see that the cut had penetrated into the body cavity, and there was a risk of infection that worried me considerably. I had broad-spectrum antibiotics in my veterinary supplies, medications I used for treating bacterial infections in seals and sea lions. I prepared an injection, calculating the dosage based on the infant's body weight and hoping the physiology was similar enough that the medication wouldn't cause adverse reactions. I administered the injection into the muscle tissue of the upper arm, choosing that location because the muscle structure there seemed most similar to human anatomy. The infant flinched when the needle went in, the first significant movement I'd seen since bringing it inside. Its eyes opened briefly, just for a second, and I got my first clear look at them. They were large and dark, almost completely black, with no visible white sclera like the mother had shown. The pupil was difficult to distinguish from the iris, giving the eyes an almost alien appearance, though the shape and position were distinctly mammalian. The eyes closed again, and the infant settled back into stillness. But I'd seen something in that brief moment of consciousness. Recognition, maybe, or at least awareness. This creature was far more cognitively developed than a human infant of comparable size would be. That made sense from an evolutionary perspective. Marine mammals generally developed much faster than terrestrial mammals, born with better motor control and sensory awareness, because the aquatic environment demanded it. I pulled up a chair and sat beside the tank, watching the subtle movements of respiration. The gills were working more smoothly now, the gill slits opening and closing in a steady rhythm roughly 12 times per minute. The chest movements suggesting lung respiration were slower, maybe 5 or 6 breaths per minute. The creature appeared to be primarily using its gills while resting, with the lungs providing supplementary gas exchange. I wondered if the lungs were used more actively during periods of high activity or if they served a different function entirely, perhaps related to buoyancy control, like a swim bladder. The more I observed, the more questions accumulated. What did these creatures eat? Where did they live when they weren't near shore? How large was their population? Were they distributed globally or limited to specific regions? Did they have a social structure? The mother's behavior suggested strong parental bonds, which implied some level of social organization. Creatures that invested significant energy in parental care typically lived in family groups or pods. And the most pressing question: what had happened to this infant? The injuries looked like propeller damage, which meant the baby had been at or near the surface in an area with boat traffic. That seemed like dangerous behavior for a species that had remained hidden from human documentation. Unless the injuries were accidental, a young creature that had strayed too close to the surface out of curiosity or inexperience. At 1:30 p.m., I noticed the first sign of improvement. The infant's breathing pattern had stabilized completely, and the bluish tint to its skin was fading. The color was returning to a healthier pale gray, similar to the mother's coloring. The gills were moving efficiently, and when I checked the water temperature and oxygen levels, both were optimal. The baby was starting to respond to treatment. I allowed myself to feel a cautious sense of hope. The wounds were still serious, and infection remained a significant risk, but the immediate crisis seemed to be passing. If the infant could maintain this stability through the next 24 hours, its chances of survival would improve dramatically. I needed to think about feeding. The creature had been in my care for 7 hours, and I had no idea what it ate or how often it needed to eat. I stood up and went to my large freezer, where I kept supplies for feeding the seals and sea lions I occasionally rehabilitated. I had frozen herring, mackerel, and squid. I thawed a small piece of herring under cold water and cut it into tiny portions, then returned to the tank. The infant was still motionless, eyes closed, breathing steadily. I held a piece of fish just below the surface of the water near its mouth, hoping to trigger some kind of feeding response. Nothing happened. I tried again, this time actually touching the fish to its lips. Still, nothing. The infant either wasn't hungry, wasn't strong enough to eat yet, or didn't recognize the fish as food in this context. I set the fish aside and made a note in the journal I'd started keeping. I'd need to try feeding again later, possibly when the infant was more alert. If it continued refusing food, I'd have to consider tube feeding, though I had no idea where the esophagus was located or what the internal anatomy looked like. I was operating completely blind, extrapolating from my knowledge of marine mammals and hoping enough would be applicable. At 4 p.m., I heard a sound from outside. That same vocalization I'd heard in the morning, the rising and falling call that carried so much emotional weight. The mother? She was calling from the water, and even from inside the house with the windows closed, I could hear her clearly. I went to the window and looked down at the cove. She was there in the shallows, her upper body visible above the water, looking up toward my house. When she saw me at the window, she called again, louder this time, more insistent. I needed to show her that the infant was alive. I didn't know if she could understand that I was trying to help, or if she simply thought I'd taken her baby. The distress in her vocalizations suggested she was experiencing significant anxiety. I made a decision quickly. I filled a large bucket with water from the tank, then carefully lifted the infant and placed it in the bucket. It was risky moving the baby when it was still so fragile, but I needed the mother to see that it was breathing, that it was being cared for. I carried the bucket to the back deck, moving as smoothly as possible to avoid jarring the infant. When I reached the deck railing, I held the bucket up so the contents would be visible from the water below. The infant's head and upper body were above the waterline, and I could see the steady movement of its breathing. The mother's reaction was immediate. She moved closer to shore, her powerful tail driving her through the water with remarkable speed. She stopped just beyond the surf line, maybe 30 feet from the base of the cliff, and stared up at us. She called again, but this time the tone was different, less distressed, more questioning. "He's alive," I called down to her, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping the tone would communicate something. "He's hurt, but he's alive. I'm giving him medicine. I'm trying to help him get better." The infant stirred in the bucket, responding to either the sound of the mother's voice or the movement of being carried outside. Its eyes opened partially, and it made a small sound, a weak chirp that was barely audible from where I stood. The mother heard it. Her whole body tensed, and she raised herself higher out of the water, revealing more of her torso. She called back, a rapid series of vocalizations that had the cadence of language, rising and falling in patterns that seemed structured rather than random. The infant responded, making another small sound, slightly stronger this time. Its head turned slightly toward the direction of the mother's voice, and I saw clear recognition in the movement. For several minutes, mother and infant exchanged vocalizations. I stood there holding the bucket, my arms beginning to ache from the weight, and watched an interaction between two beings that science didn't believe existed. The mother's calls were complex, varying in pitch and duration, carrying what seemed like distinct emotional content, reassurance, maybe, or instructions. The infant's responses were weaker, but followed similar patterns, suggesting these creatures had sophisticated vocal communication abilities. Eventually, the mother's calls became quieter, less frequent. She remained in the water, watching, but the frantic energy from earlier had diminished. She seemed to understand, or at least accept, that the infant was alive and not in immediate danger. I carefully carried the bucket back inside and returned the infant to the tank. The brief exposure to outside air and the stimulation of hearing its mother seemed to have energized it slightly. The eyes remained open for a few minutes after I placed it back in the water, tracking my movements as I adjusted its position in the mesh support. "Your mother's worried about you," I said quietly, checking the bandages I'd secured over the wounds. They were holding well, and there was no sign of bleeding. "But you're going to be okay. I'm going to make sure you're okay, and then you can go back to her." The infant's eyes focused on my face, and for a moment I had the distinct impression it was studying me with the same intensity I was studying it. Then the eyes slowly closed and it settled back into rest. I sat down again and began writing detailed notes about everything I'd observed: the respiration patterns, the physical responses to treatment, the vocalization exchange with the mother, every detail I could capture. If I couldn't share this discovery with the scientific community, at least I could document it properly for myself. Chapter 4. An Impossible Choice. The first night was the hardest. I set up a cot in the rehabilitation room so I could monitor the infant continuously, checking vital signs every 30 minutes and watching for any changes in condition. The tank had a small water heater that I'd adjusted to maintain a constant temperature of 53 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'd installed an additional oxygen system to ensure the water stayed well aerated. I'd also positioned a UV sterilization unit to run continuously, keeping the water as clean as possible to minimize infection risk. At 11 p.m., the infant developed what appeared to be a fever. Its skin temperature increased noticeably, and its breathing became rapid again, both the gill movements and the lung respiration accelerating in a way that suggested distress. I'd been expecting this. Fever was a natural immune response, and given the severity of the wounds, some level of systemic infection was almost inevitable, despite the antibiotics I'd administered. I spent 2 hours managing the fever, gradually cooling the water temperature by a few degrees and applying cool compresses to the infant's forehead and neck. The creature was semi-conscious during this period, making small, distressed sounds and occasionally opening its eyes. At one point, It reached out with one of its small webbed hands and grasped my finger where I'd placed my hand in the water to adjust its position. The grip was surprisingly strong, and the gesture was so clearly a plea for comfort that I felt tears sting my eyes. "I know it hurts," I whispered, keeping my hand still so it could maintain its grip. "But the medicine is working. Your body is fighting the infection. You just need to hold on." The fever broke around 1:30 a.m. The infant's temperature gradually decreased, and its breathing returned to the steadier pattern I'd observed earlier in the day. The small hand released its grip on my finger, and the creature settled back into a deeper sleep. I checked the wounds carefully, looking for signs of worsening infection, but the bandages were clean, and the tissue around the lacerations looked slightly better than it had that morning. The edges were beginning to close, and the inflammation had decreased. I finally allowed myself to lie down on the cot, though I didn't really sleep. I dozed in 20-minute intervals, waking each time to check the tank, and spent the dark hours thinking about what I was going to do. The responsible thing, the thing every part of my scientific training demanded, would be to contact the appropriate authorities. The discovery of a new species, particularly one this significant, needed to be properly documented and studied. There were protocols for this kind of thing, institutions that specialized in xenobiological research, government agencies that handled the protection of endangered species. These creatures, whatever they were, deserved the full resources of the scientific community to understand and protect them. But I couldn't shake the image of the mother's face as she'd handed me her infant. The desperation, the trust, the clear understanding that she was taking an enormous risk by approaching a human. And I kept thinking about what would happen if I made that phone call. They would come for the infant immediately, government scientists, military personnel maybe. The baby would be taken to a secure facility somewhere, studied, tested, kept in isolation. And the mother, they would search for her. Boats equipped with sonar, nets, possibly tranquilizers or worse. If they found her, she would be captured. If they didn't find her, they would search these waters until they did, disrupting the entire ecosystem in the process. And once the world knew these creatures existed, there would be no going back. Hunters would come, looking for proof or trophies. Tourist boats would crowd the coastline. Scientists would swarm every possible habitat. The life these beings had managed to maintain in secret for thousands of years would be destroyed in a matter of months. I went back inside and carefully lifted the infant from the tank, supporting its body properly and keeping its head elevated. It was more alert this morning, eyes opening fully when I moved it, and it made a small sound that seemed less distressed than the previous day. I carried it back out to the deck and held it up so the mother could see. The mother's reaction confirmed what I'd already suspected. She raised herself high out of the water, and the vocalizations she made were clearly expressions of relief. The infant responded immediately, becoming more animated than I'd seen it yet, making a series of chirping sounds and moving its arms in what looked like an attempt to reach toward its mother. I stood there for 5 minutes, allowing them to communicate. The exchange was complex and clearly structured, with the mother making longer vocalizations that the infant responded to with shorter sounds. I was witnessing language, I realized. Not random animal calls, but actual linguistic communication between two intelligent beings. That was the moment I made my final decision. I couldn't report this. I couldn't be responsible for destroying whatever life these creatures had built in the hidden places of the ocean. The mother had trusted me with the most precious thing in her world, and I had to honor that trust. I would care for the infant until it was healthy enough to return to the water. I would document everything privately for my own records, but I wouldn't share it with anyone. And I would keep this stretch of coastline as protected as I could, making sure no one disturbed these waters. I carried the infant back inside and returned it to the tank. It had been active for several minutes, which meant it was recovering well. The fever had passed, the wounds were healing, and its strength was returning. In another week, maybe 2, it would be ready to go home. I spent the rest of that morning establishing what would become my routine for the next 3 weeks. Feed the infant every 4 hours, though it took several days before it would accept food. Monitor vital signs continuously. Change the tank water twice daily. Document everything in my private journals. And twice each day, morning and evening, I would carry the infant to the deck so it could see and communicate with its mother. The mother came every single day, sometimes staying for hours in the waters below my property. She would call to the infant, and they would exchange vocalizations for as long as I could safely keep the baby outside. I began to recognize patterns in their communication, certain sounds that seemed to be reassurances, others that sounded like questions, others still that might have been the equivalent of naming or identification. On the 3rd day, the infant accepted food for the first time. I'd been offering small pieces of fresh mackerel, holding them near its mouth and waiting patiently. It had refused everything until that morning, when it suddenly opened its mouth and took the fish from my fingers. The movement was deliberate and careful, and afterward, it looked at me as if waiting to see if this was acceptable. I smiled and offered another piece, which it also took. "Good," I said softly. "You need to eat. You need to get strong so you can go back to your mother." By the end of the first week, the infant was eating regularly and had gained noticeable strength. It could move around the tank under its own power, using its small tail for propulsion and its arms for steering. The wounds were healing remarkably well, the lacerations closing cleanly without signs of infection. The deepest wound, the one that had penetrated into the body cavity, was taking longer to heal, but even that was showing steady improvement. I began to notice distinct personality traits. The infant was curious, watching everything I did with apparent interest. When I was working at my desk in the corner of the room, it would position itself in the tank to keep me in view. When I spoke, it would turn its head toward the sound of my voice, and it began responding to my presence with what seemed like recognition, making small vocalizations when I entered the room that were different from the sounds it made at other times. I documented all of this in my journals, along with the technical observations about healing rates and behavioral patterns. But I also wrote about the emotional experience, the strange connection I was forming with a creature that shouldn't exist, and the growing dread I felt about what would happen when it was time to say goodbye, because I was getting attached. I tried to maintain professional distance, tried to think of the infant as a research subject rather than an individual, but it was impossible. This was a child, intelligent and aware, and I'd spent nearly 2 weeks caring for it. I'd held it when it was feverish, fed it when it was hungry, watched it gain strength day by day. I knew that returning it to the ocean was the right thing to do, the only thing to do, but the thought of never seeing it again was becoming painful. On the evening of the 14th day, I carried the infant out to the deck for the usual communication session with its mother. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of orange and pink, and the mother was waiting as always in the shallows below. The mother responded with what could only be described as excitement. Her calls became rapid and musical, and she moved closer to shore than I'd ever seen her come, into water so shallow that her tail was scraping the bottom. The infant looked at me, and in its large dark eyes, I saw clear intention. It wanted to go home. It was ready. I looked down at the mother, then back at the infant in my arms. The wounds were healed enough. The creature was strong enough, and keeping it any longer would be selfish, putting my own emotional needs above what was best for this family. "Tomorrow," I said, my voice tight, "tomorrow you can go home." Chapter 5. Healing and Discovery. The final week of the infant's recovery brought observations that challenged everything I thought I understood about intelligence, communication, and the boundaries between human and animal cognition. What had begun as medical rehabilitation evolved into something closer to interspecies education, though I couldn't always determine who was teaching whom. On the 15th day, I introduced toys into the tank. I'd done this routinely with seal pups during rehabilitation, providing objects for environmental enrichment and cognitive stimulation. I started with simple items: a rubber ball, a length of kelp with the holdfast still attached, and a smooth piece of driftwood about 8 inches long. The infant's response exceeded anything I'd observed in pinnipeds. Rather than simply mouthing or batting at the objects, it examined each one systematically, turning them over with its hands, holding them up to the light, and arranging them in different configurations at the bottom of the tank. The most striking behavior involved the driftwood. The infant spent nearly 20 minutes positioning it at various angles against the side of the tank as if testing how it interacted with the space. At one point, it placed the wood vertically and released it, watching it slowly tip and fall. Then it repeated the action, but this time caught the wood before it fell completely. It did this 7 times in succession, each time catching the wood at a slightly different angle. This wasn't random play, this was experimentation, testing cause and effect with methodical precision. I recorded everything on video, narrating my observations in real time. The footage would never be seen by anyone else, but the discipline of documentation helped me process what I was witnessing. I described the infant's problem-solving approach, its apparent understanding of object permanence when it hid the ball behind the kelp and then retrieved it, and the way it seemed to anticipate my actions when I reached into the tank. By the 16th day, the infant had developed a routine that mirrored my own. It would wake when I entered the room in the morning, become active during feeding times, and rest during the afternoon hours when I typically worked at my desk. But the most remarkable development was its apparent attempt to understand my tools and equipment. When I used my stethoscope to check its heartbeat, it would reach up and touch the instrument, tracing the tubes with its fingers. When I wrote in my journal, it would watch the movement of my pen across the paper with focused attention, its head moving to follow each line. On the 17th day, I made a decision that violated every principle of scientific objectivity, but felt necessary, given the unusual circumstances. I began talking to the infant more deliberately, not just casual commentary, but structured communication. I would point to objects and name them: water, fish, hand. I had no expectation that the creature could produce human speech. Its vocal anatomy was clearly different, lacking the precise control of tongue, lips, and soft palate that human language required. But I wanted to test whether it could comprehend the connection between sounds and meanings. The results were startling. Within 2 days, the infant began responding to specific words with appropriate actions. When I said fish, it would move to the feeding area of the tank. When I said mother, it would turn toward the window that faced the cove. When I said water, it would submerge completely. The responses were too consistent to be coincidental. This creature was learning to understand human language with the same facility a dog might, but with what appeared to be much deeper comprehension. I expanded the vocabulary, adding descriptive words: good, gentle, careful. When I said gentle while offering food, the infant would take it slowly from my fingers rather than snatching. When I said careful before checking its wounds, it would hold still and allow me to work. The learning curve was extraordinary, suggesting cognitive abilities that matched or exceeded those of great apes or cetaceans. The wounds continued to heal with remarkable efficiency. By the 18th day, all 3 lacerations had closed completely, leaving only pale scars visible on the gray skin. The deepest wound, which had concerned me most, showed no signs of infection or complication. The tissue had knitted together cleanly, and the infant showed no sensitivity when I palpated the area during examinations. Whatever the physiological mechanisms were that governed healing in these creatures, they were impressively effective. The infant made a soft vocalization, the same sound it had started using when it wanted my attention. I stood up and moved closer to the tank. The creature's eyes followed my movement, then shifted back to the laptop on the desk. I had an idea. I pulled my chair closer to the tank and positioned the laptop so the screen was visible to the infant. I opened a simple drawing program and used the mouse to create basic shapes on the screen: circle, square, triangle. The infant watched with absolute focus, its head tilting slightly as the shapes appeared. Then I did something I'd been curious about for days. I tapped the glass of the tank with my finger, then tapped the laptop screen in the same rhythm. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 quick taps. The infant watched. Then it raised its hand and tapped the tank glass from its side. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 quick taps. My breath caught. I changed the pattern. 2 taps, pause, 4 taps, pause, 1 tap. The infant replicated it perfectly. For the next hour, we played this game. I would create patterns, and the infant would mirror them. Simple rhythms, then more complex sequences. The creature never made an error, never failed to replicate exactly what I'd demonstrated. This wasn't just mimicry. This was understanding pattern and sequence at a level that indicated genuine mathematical thinking. I expanded the experiment. I used colored markers to draw shapes on a piece of paper, holding them up to the tank. Red circle, blue square, green triangle. Then I showed the shapes in a sequence: red, blue, green, red, blue, green. I paused and looked at the infant expectantly. It pointed with one finger at the empty space beyond the last shape I'd shown. Then it tapped 3 times. 3 more shapes in the sequence. "Yes," I whispered, 3 more. "You understand patterns. You understand sequences." I drew 3 more shapes following the pattern and held them up. The infant made a sound that I'd started to recognize as satisfaction or pleasure, a rising tone that ended with a soft trill. That evening, when I carried the infant out to the deck for its communication session with the mother, I witnessed something that provided context for what I'd been observing. The mother and infant went through their usual exchange of vocalizations, but this time the pattern was different. The mother would make a complex series of sounds, then pause. The infant would repeat the sounds back, though in a slightly higher register. The mother would make the sounds again, this time with a small variation. The infant would replicate the variation. They were teaching and learning. The mother was passing down information, possibly language, possibly cultural knowledge, and the infant was absorbing it with the same remarkable facility it had shown with my pattern games. I was watching education happen. These weren't simple animals operating on instinct. These were beings with culture, with language, with the capacity to pass knowledge between generations. The implications were staggering. On the 20th day, I began seriously preparing for the infant's return to the ocean. The creature was fully healed, strong, and clearly ready to leave. Every day it spent in the tank was another day separated from its mother and its natural environment. I needed to let it go, but I also needed to ensure its safety. I spent hours observing the cove, documenting boat traffic and human activity. My stretch of coastline was generally isolated, but there were occasional fishing boats that passed within a few hundred yards, and during weekends, pleasure craft sometimes explored the area. I needed to choose a time when the risk of human encounter would be minimal. I also needed to understand where these creatures lived. The mother appeared in the cove daily, but she clearly came from somewhere else. I'd never seen her here before the infant was injured, which meant this wasn't her normal territory. During one of the evening communication sessions, I watched carefully to see which direction she came from and returned to. She consistently appeared from the north and disappeared to the north, suggesting her home range was somewhere up the coast. I consulted my maps and charts of the local coastline. About 8 miles north, there was a series of sea caves that I'd explored years ago during a kayaking trip. The caves were extensive, with multiple chambers, some above the waterline and others completely submerged. The area was protected from boat traffic by dangerous rocks and strong currents, making it effectively inaccessible except at specific tidal conditions. If I were a creature trying to remain hidden from humans, that would be an ideal location. On the 21st day, I made my final decision. I would return the infant to its mother the following morning at dawn, when the tide would be right and human activity would be minimal. I would carry it down to the beach and wade out into the shallows, allowing the mother to retrieve it in the water. And then I would let them go, returning to my ordinary life as if the previous 3 weeks had never happened. That final night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat beside the tank watching the infant rest and thought about everything I'd learned and everything I'd never be able to share with the scientific community. I thought about the questions that would remain unanswered, the research that would never be conducted, the understanding that would never be achieved. But I also thought about the mother waiting in the cold water every day for 3 weeks and the trust she'd shown by bringing me her dying child, and I knew I was making the right choice. At 5 a.m., I began the preparations. I filled a large container with seawater and carefully transferred the infant into it. The creature seemed to understand something significant was happening. It was more alert than usual, vocalizing softly and watching my movements with focused attention. "You're going home," I told it, my voice unsteady. "You're going back to your mother, where you belong." I carried the container to the back door and paused, looking around the rehabilitation room one final time. 3 weeks ago, I'd brought a dying creature into this space, and now I was returning a healthy, intelligent being to its family. Whatever happened next, I'd done the one thing that mattered. I'd kept it safe. I opened the door and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The sky was just beginning to lighten along the eastern horizon, and the air was cold enough that I could see my breath. I began the long descent down the 83 steps to the beach below, carrying the container carefully, and prepared myself for goodbye. Chapter 6. The First Night. The beach was empty and silent except for the rhythmic sound of waves breaking against the rocks. I reached the bottom of the stairs just as the first pale light of dawn began spreading across the water. The tide was at mid-level, perfect for what I needed to do. I set the container down on the sand and looked out toward the water, searching for any sign of the mother. She was already there. I could see her dark shape just beyond the surf line, exactly where she'd been every morning and evening for the past 3 weeks. When she saw me on the beach with the container, she moved closer, cutting through the water with powerful strokes of her tail. She stopped in water that was perhaps 4 feet deep, about 20 feet from shore, and raised herself upright so her entire torso was visible above the surface. She turned and began swimming away, still holding the infant. But before she disappeared into the deeper water, she stopped and looked back at me one more time. The infant, looking over her shoulder, raised one small hand in what looked exactly like a wave. I lifted my hand and waved back, and then they were gone, diving beneath the surface and vanishing into the gray-green water. I stood there alone in the surf for several more minutes, shaking from the cold and from the emotional weight of what had just happened. Then I turned and waded back to shore, retrieved the empty container, and began the long climb back up the stairs to my house. My legs were numb from the cold water, and I had to stop twice to rest, but eventually I made it to the top. Inside, the rehabilitation room felt strange and empty. The tank where the infant had spent 3 weeks still held water. Equipment was scattered around. Medical supplies lay open on the counter. It looked like a recently vacated hospital room, which in a sense it was. I stood in the doorway and felt the full impact of the absence. For 3 weeks, this room had been the center of my entire existence. Now, it was just an empty space. I spent that day cleaning and organizing, returning the room to its normal state. I drained the tank, washed all the equipment, put away the medical supplies. I packed up my journals and the tissue samples I'd collected and locked them in the filing cabinet in my office. I took down the video camera and stored the tapes in a box that I labeled with innocuous markings that wouldn't attract attention. By evening, the room looked exactly as it had before May 17th, before everything had changed. But I couldn't settle. I kept walking to the windows, looking down at the cove, searching for any sign of movement in the water. The rational part of my brain knew they were gone, that they'd returned to wherever they lived, that there was no reason for them to stay near my property now. But some irrational part of me hoped I might see them one more time. At 8 p.m., as the last light was fading from the sky, I grabbed a flashlight and went down to the beach again. The tide was coming in and the sand was damp from the waves. I walked the length of the small cove, looking at the waterline, though I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Some sign, maybe, some evidence that the morning's events had been real and not some elaborate fever dream. I found nothing, of course. The ocean kept its secrets well. I returned to the house as darkness fell completely, and I stood on my deck looking out at the black water and tried to process everything that had happened. That night, I began the work of figuring out how to live with what I knew. I couldn't share this information with anyone, not my colleagues at the Marine Mammal Center, not the scientific journals I regularly published in, not even friends or family. The secret had to remain mine alone, because the alternative, exposing these creatures to the world, was unthinkable. I made myself dinner, but barely tasted it. I tried to read, but couldn't focus on the words. Finally, I gave up and went to bed early, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the day. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in the darkness and thought about the infant's hand touching my arm in that final moment, before it swam away. I thought about the mother's hand grasping mine in acknowledgement. I thought about how my life had been irrevocably changed by 3 weeks of caring for something that science insisted couldn't exist. At some point in the early morning hours, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. I dreamed of swimming in deep water, surrounded by dark shapes that moved with fluid grace, and of voices that sang in patterns I couldn't quite understand, but that felt almost familiar. Chapter 7. The Mother's Vigil. The days following the infant's return were among the strangest of my life. I went back to my normal routines, working on my research, checking in with the Marine Mammal Center, conducting my regular patrols of the coastline, but everything felt hollow and performative. I was going through the motions of being the person I'd been before May 17th, but that person didn't exist anymore. I'd seen too much. I knew too much. I found myself visiting the cove constantly, walking down to the beach at odd hours, scanning the water for any sign of movement. I told myself I was just maintaining my normal observation habits, documenting wildlife activity in the area, but I knew the truth. I was looking for them. I wanted confirmation that the infant had fully integrated back into its natural life, that the wounds had continued healing properly, that my decision to return it had been the right one. For the first week, I saw nothing. The water remained empty of anything except the usual harbor seals and occasional sea otters. I began to wonder if the mother and infant had moved on completely, returning to their home range wherever that was, leaving this stretch of coast behind. It made sense. There was no reason for them to stay in an area where they'd experienced trauma and where contact with humans had occurred. But on the 8th day after the reunion, I saw her. I'd gone down to the beach just after dawn, as had become my habit. The morning was overcast, the kind of heavy gray sky that made the ocean and air blend into a single colorless expanse. I was walking along the waterline, examining tidal debris, when I noticed a shape in the water, near the rocks at the north end of the cove. I stopped and watched. The shape moved slightly, and I realized it was the mother, She was floating in the kelp beds, her upper body occasionally visible above the surface. She wasn't calling out or trying to get my attention. She was simply there, watching the beach, watching my house. The infant reached out and touched my face with both hands, exploring my features with its webbed fingers. It touched my eyes, my nose, my mouth, making soft sounds the entire time. Then it wrapped its small arms around my neck in what was unmistakably a hug. I felt my throat tighten with emotion. I put my arms around the small body carefully, returning the embrace, and said, "You're okay. You're really okay. I'm so glad." The infant released me and dove under the water, swimming a quick circle around my legs before surfacing again. It was playing, showing off its strength and speed. I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had since they'd left, and the infant seemed to recognize the sound as positive because it made a sound that might have been its version of laughter. The mother had moved closer during this interaction, though she still maintained some distance. She was watching carefully, clearly monitoring the situation, but not interfering. When the infant swam back to her, she gathered it close and made a series of vocalizations that had the cadence of scolding or warning. The infant responded with what sounded like protests or excuses, and I witnessed what appeared to be a very normal parent-child disagreement about appropriate behavior. Eventually, the mother looked at me directly and made a sound that was clearly directed at me, rather than the infant. The tone was different from the sound she used with her child, lower and more complex. I had no idea what it meant, but I interpreted it as acknowledgement. She'd let the infant approach me, had allowed this interaction, and now she was indicating it was time for them to leave. "Thank you," I called across the water. "Thank you for showing me he's okay, for trusting me." She regarded me for a moment longer, then turned and began swimming north, the infant following close beside her. But this time, they didn't disappear immediately. They swam along the surface, visible for several minutes, until they rounded the rocky point at the end of the cove and vanished from sight. This became the pattern for the next 2 weeks. The mother and infant would appear at dawn, stay for 15 or 20 minutes, sometimes closer to shore, and sometimes farther out, then leave. The infant's confidence grew with each visit. It would swim close to the beach, interact with me in the dark shallows, show me new skills it had developed. I watched it catch its first fish during one visit, a small perch that it grabbed with impressive speed and consumed in 2 bites. The mother watched this accomplishment with what I interpreted as pride. I began documenting these visits in my private journals, noting changes in the infant's size and behavior, recording the vocalizations I heard, and trying to understand what this ongoing contact meant. The mother was deliberately bringing the infant back to see me. This wasn't accidental or coincidental. She was making a choice to maintain some kind of connection. On one particularly calm morning, about 3 weeks after the initial reunion, the mother did something unexpected. She swam to the kelp beds near the North Rocks, dove down, and emerged holding something in her hands. She brought it toward the beach, closer than she usually came, and held it up for me to see. It was an abalone shell, large and beautiful, the interior surface, displaying that characteristic iridescent mother-of-pearl. She called to me, then placed the shell carefully on a flat rock that was just above the waterline, positioned so it wouldn't wash away with the tide. Then she backed away and watched me. I waded out to the rock and picked up the shell. It was perfect, unblemished, the kind of specimen collectors would prize. I held it up so she could see I'd received it, and I said, "Thank you. This is beautiful." Eventually, I stood up and climbed the stairs back to my house. My normal life was waiting, my research, my work, my routine. Everything would go back to the way it had been before May 17th. Except, of course, it wouldn't. Nothing would ever be quite the same again. Chapter 8: Healing and Discovery. The months following that final visit were a period of adjustment and reflection. I threw myself into my work with renewed intensity, as if constant activity could somehow fill the space left by the absence of those dawn meetings. I took on additional projects for the Marine Mammal Center, volunteered for extra patrols, and spent long hours updating my research on the gray whale population. But underneath all that activity, I was processing what I'd experienced and trying to figure out how to live with knowledge I could never share. Shapes moved in the water, perhaps 50 yards offshore, multiple shapes, more than just two. I could make out the rise and fall of bodies breaking the surface, the occasional glimpse of an arm or head, but the fog was too thick for details. The vocalizations continued, a complex exchange between what sounded like at least 4 or 5 individuals. They were communicating, discussing something, perhaps even arguing based on the overlapping nature of the calls. I stood perfectly still, barely breathing, and listened. The exchange continued for several minutes, and then gradually the voices moved away, traveling north along the coast. I heard them growing fainter and fainter, until eventually there was nothing but the sound of waves and distant seabirds. I'd just encountered evidence of a pod. The mother and infant weren't alone. There were others, multiple individuals, living somewhere in these waters. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a single family of unusual creatures. This was a population, possibly even a full species, with its own social structures and territories. The paddle took me nearly an hour, following the coastline and navigating around rocky outcroppings and kelp beds. The sea caves were located in a section of cliff that rose nearly 200 feet above the water, dark volcanic rock, pocked with erosion and covered in places with moss and hardy plants that could survive the salt spray. The caves themselves were barely visible from the water, just dark openings in the rock face, some at water level, and others accessible only at low tide. I approached cautiously, listening for any sounds and watching for any movement. The water around the caves was deep, maybe 40 or 50 feet, with occasional rocks breaking the surface. The kelp was thick here, creating dense forests that would provide excellent cover for anything moving beneath the surface. I paddled to the largest cave entrance, an opening about 15 feet wide and 10 feet high at the current tide level. The interior was dark, but I could hear water echoing against stone walls deeper inside. I turned on my waterproof flashlight and pointed it into the cave. The walls were smooth, worn by millennia of wave action, and covered with sea stars, anemones, and other marine life. The cave extended back into darkness beyond where my light could reach. I didn't dare enter. The current was tricky here, and if conditions changed, I could easily be trapped inside. But I floated at the entrance for several minutes, observing, listening, looking for any signs of habitation or activity. That's when I noticed the marks on the cave wall. They were about 6 feet above the current waterline, placed where high tide would submerge them, but where they would be visible and accessible at lower tides. The marks were clearly deliberate, carved or scratched into the rock surface with something hard enough to score the volcanic stone. They consisted of parallel lines of varying lengths, arranged in groups that seemed almost like tallies or counting marks. I took photographs with my waterproof camera, capturing the marks from multiple angles. They could have been natural, I told myself, some kind of erosion pattern or the result of debris scraping against the rock. But they looked too regular, too purposeful. They looked like someone was keeping track of something, days maybe, or cycles of the moon, or passages through the area. I explored 2 more cave entrances that morning, finding similar marks in both locations. In one cave, I found what looked like a small pile of shells arranged on a rock ledge above the waterline. The shells were all of similar size and type, all positioned with their open sides facing up. It could have been coincidence, or it could have been deliberate arrangement. There was no way to know for certain. I paddled back to the launch site with my mind racing. I couldn't prove what I suspected. I couldn't show these photographs to anyone or discuss what they might mean without revealing why I was so interested in this particular area. But for my own understanding, I felt increasingly confident that these caves served as some kind of home base or regular stopping point for the population that lived in these waters. Over the following months, I returned to the area several times, always careful to maintain a respectful distance and never entering the caves themselves. I documented additional marks, observed patterns in how debris accumulated around the cave entrances, and noted that certain areas seemed to be kept clear of kelp and other growth in ways that suggested regular use. In October, I witnessed something that confirmed my suspicions beyond any doubt. I'd launched early, before dawn, hoping to observe the caves during the transition from darkness to daylight. I was about 100 yards from the main cave entrance, floating quietly in my kayak, when I saw movement in the water near the rocks. A figure surfaced, then another, then 3 more. They were difficult to see in the pre-dawn gloom, but I could make out the distinctive shape of heads and shoulders, the powerful movement of tails beneath the surface. 5 individuals, ranging in size from what appeared to be a large adult to something smaller that might have been an adolescent. They were vocalizing to each other, not loudly, but in that conversational tone I'd heard before. After a few minutes, they dove and disappeared into the cave entrance. No, the secret had to remain mine. The creatures I'd come to think of as the ocean people had managed to survive in hiding for thousands of years, possibly longer. Who was I to expose them just so I could publish papers and gain recognition for a scientific discovery? Their survival was more important than my career, more important than human knowledge, more important than anything except their right to continue existing in peace. By the time winter storms made the ocean too dangerous for kayaking, I'd made peace with my decision. I would keep watching, keep documenting privately, and keep protecting their secret. It was the only ethical choice I could make. Chapter 9. The goodbye spring came, bringing calmer seas and the return of migrating whales to the coastal waters. I resumed my regular research activities, tracking the gray whale population as they moved north toward their feeding grounds in Alaska. The work was familiar and comforting, a return to the routine I'd known for decades. But everything felt different now. Every time I saw movement in the water, every vocalization I heard, I wondered if it might be them. I didn't see the mother or the infant for almost a year. There were occasional signs, vocalizations in the fog, distant shapes in the water near the sea caves, unexplained disturbances in the kelp beds that suggested large bodies moving through. But no direct encounters, no clear sightings. I told myself this was good. It meant they were being cautious, maintaining their safety, living their lives without human interference. But I missed them. I missed those dawn meetings, the infants' playful approaches, the mother's careful watchfulness. I missed feeling connected to something extraordinary, being part of a secret that changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Then on May 16, 1994, exactly 1 day before the anniversary of our first meeting, they returned. I was on the beach at dawn, as had become my habit regardless of whether I expected to see anything. The morning was clear and cold, with a light breeze coming off the ocean. I was walking along the waterline examining the tidal debris when I heard a familiar sound. That rising vocalization, musical and complex, that I'd learned to recognize as a greeting. I turned toward the water and felt my heart leap. The mother was there, floating in the shallows about 30 feet offshore, and beside her was the infant, except it wasn't an infant anymore. In the year since I'd last seen them, the young one had grown dramatically. It was now nearly 5 feet long, still smaller than the mother's 7 feet, but clearly an adolescent rather than a baby. The proportions had changed too, becoming more adult-like, with longer limbs and a more powerful tail. "Hello," I called out, unable to keep the joy from my voice. "I can't believe you're here. I can't believe you came back." The mother made a responding vocalization, and the young one, I still thought of it as him, even though I knew the distinction might not be meaningful in their species, immediately swam toward the beach. He moved with confidence and speed, showing none of the weakness or injury that had defined our first encounters. When he reached the shallows, he raised himself upright and called to me with obvious excitement. I waded into the water, laughing at his enthusiasm, and he met me halfway. He was almost as tall as my chest now, heavy and solid with muscle. When he wrapped his arms around me in greeting, I could feel the strength in his body. This was no longer a fragile infant. This was a healthy, powerful young creature, fully adapted to his environment. "Look at you," I said, pulling back to see him better. "You've grown so much. You're enormous." He chirped and dove under the water, swimming rapid circles around my legs before surfacing again. He was showing off, displaying his abilities with obvious pride. I could see that the scars from his injuries were still visible on his left side, but they'd faded to thin silver lines that barely stood out against his gray skin. They would mark him for life, but they clearly caused no functional impairment. The mother had moved closer during this reunion, though she still maintained some distance. I looked at her and said, "Thank you. Thank you for bringing him back, for letting me see that he's okay." She regarded me with those large, intelligent eyes and made a soft sound that I interpreted as acknowledgement. Then she called to her son with a series of sharp vocalizations that clearly meant, "Come here now." He responded immediately, swimming back to her side with just a hint of reluctance. But this time, something different happened. When they were about 50 yards offshore, they stopped and turned back. The mother raised herself high out of the water, higher than I'd ever seen her rise, and made a long, loud vocalization that echoed across the cove. It sounded like a farewell, but also like an announcement or declaration. Then she dove, and her son dove with her, and they were gone. I stood in the shallows holding the carved stone, watching the water where they'd disappeared, and I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't see them again. This had been a final goodbye, a closing of the chapter we'd shared. I carried the stone back to my house and placed it next to the abalone shell on my desk. These two objects became the physical evidence of an impossible encounter, the only tangible proof I would ever have that those weeks in 1993 had been real. Over the following years, I continued my work as a marine biologist, published my research on whale populations, and maintained my position with the Marine Mammal Center. I never spoke about what I'd experienced, though there were times when colleagues would discuss cryptozoology or unusual sightings, and I would have to bite my tongue to keep from sharing what I knew. I continued monitoring the sea caves, making regular kayaking trips to document any changes or activities. I recorded vocalizations occasionally in the fog, saw distant shapes that might have been them, and found new markings carved into the cave. Walls that suggested continued habitation. The ocean people were still there, still living their hidden lives, and I was content knowing they remained undiscovered. I retired from formal academic work in 2015, though I continued my private observations. I'm 61 years old now, and I've spent more than half my life keeping this secret. I've filled dozens of journals with observations and documentation that will never be published. I've collected enough evidence to revolutionize marine biology, and I've locked it all away where no one will ever find it, until now. Until I decided it was time to tell this story, not as a scientific paper or public revelation, but as a personal account that most people will dismiss as fiction. I'm telling it because I believe these beings deserve to have their existence acknowledged, even if only in a format that allows for plausible deniability. I'm telling it because the weight of carrying this secret alone for 3 decades has become too heavy. And I'm telling it because last month something happened that made me realize the story wasn't over. Chapter 10. What I Still See. On the morning of December 3, 2025, I was on the beach at dawn as usual, sipping coffee from my thermos and watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of pink and gold. The air was cold, maybe 45 degrees, and my breath formed clouds in front of my face. I'd been up since 4:30 a.m., unable to sleep, restless with a feeling I couldn't quite identify. Anticipation, maybe, or unease. Something was about to happen. At 6:47 a.m., I noted the time later because it was exactly 32 years to the minute after I'd first heard the mother's distress calls. I saw movement in the water near the rocks at the north end of the cove. A figure surfaced. Large, powerful, moving with confident purpose. As it came closer to shore, I realized with a shock that I recognized the proportions, the movement patterns, the distinctive scars on the left side of the torso. This was the infant I'd saved in 1993, now fully grown and nearly as large as his mother had been. He was not alone. Beside him, staying close but clearly requiring his protection, was a smaller figure, much smaller, maybe 3 feet long, with pale skin that looked almost translucent in the early morning light. An infant, his infant. They stopped in water about 20 feet offshore, and the adult male, I still thought of him as Samuel, though I'd never spoken that name aloud in his presence, raised himself upright and called to me. The vocalization was deeper now, more resonant, but it carried the same greeting pattern I'd learned to recognize decades ago. I set down my thermos with shaking hands and walked to the edge of the water. "Is that really you?" I called. "Did you really come back?" He responded with a series of vocalizations, then gently guided the infant forward. The small one moved hesitantly, clearly uncertain about approaching the shore and the strange, tall creature standing there. Samuel made encouraging sounds and pushed his child gently toward me. I raised my own hand and pressed it against my chest, then extended it toward him, mirroring his gesture. "Thank you," I said, my voice breaking. "Thank you for remembering. Thank you for trusting me with this." Samuel made one final vocalization, that same deep, resonant sound his mother had made all those years ago. Then he turned and began swimming away, his infant staying close to his side. They moved north along the coast, and I stood in the shallows watching them until they disappeared around the rocky point. I returned to my house in a daze. I'd just witnessed something extraordinary, proof that the connection formed in 1993 had endured across decades and generations. Samuel had not only survived and thrived, he'd found a mate and produced offspring, and he'd chosen to bring that offspring to meet me. The trust his mother had shown had been inherited, passed down, and now extended to a third generation. That evening, I opened the filing cabinet in my office and pulled out all the journals I'd kept over the past 32 years. Hundreds of pages of observations, documentation, sketches, and photographs. A lifetime of secret knowledge. I reread the entries from those first 3 weeks in 1993, remembering every detail of caring for the injured infant, the fear and wonder I'd felt, the weight of deciding to keep this discovery hidden. And I made a decision. I would tell the story, not as a scientific paper, not as proof or evidence, but as a personal account. I would present it in a way that allowed people to receive it as truth or as fiction according to their own beliefs. Those who needed to dismiss it as an elaborate story could do so. Those who recognized the ring of truth would understand. Because the ocean people deserve to have their existence acknowledged, even if only in this limited way. They deserve to be known as intelligent, emotional, social beings worthy of respect and protection. And if telling this story means risking my reputation or credibility, so be it. I'm 61 years old, I'm retired, and my career is behind me. What remains is the truth, and the hope that somewhere in the vast ocean, Samuel and his child swim free and safe. I still visit the cove every morning at dawn. I still make the kayaking trips to the sea caves every few months. I still record vocalizations in the fog, and document signs of their presence. And sometimes, very rarely, I see shapes in the water that might be them. I never approach now. I've learned that the greatest gift I can give them is my restraint, my silence, my willingness to let them live their lives without interference. But I keep watching, and I keep hoping, and I keep the carved stone and the abalone shell on my desk as reminders that for a brief window of time, two worlds touched, and trust was possible between beings who should have been too different to ever understand each other. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but now at least one of those secrets has been spoken aloud, and perhaps that's enough.